when Hamad wrote to me about this panel, he sent me a series of suggestions on the areas that I might cover. And he started with a very provocative quotation, a half of a quotation, a half of a sentence from Irit Rogov. Cultural diplomacy is the evil twin of neoliberal capital. And cultural diplomacy here would be obviously national cultural diplomacy. And I do know Irit a little, and I'd like to begin with this proposition. I said to Hamad, it's good you bring in Irit Rogov's provocative statement. My response here is also an answer to some of the questions you posed to me. All such formulations are ideologically and situationally conducted. More pertinently, they are positioned by the political exigencies perceived by the speaker or writer. Irit Rogov is an Israeli dissident. Her reason for hating the nation are self-evident. Not unexpectedly, Irit is particularly alert to the question of territory. Israel's sense of nationhood is one thing, its claim to ancient territorial rights is another. Deterritorialization, which is a concept Irit speaks about, is a conceptual schema and does not alleviate either problem on the ground. On a larger scale of reference, therefore, I would like to just map for a minute the question of the national. And I, of course, start with this because the Festival of India exhibition was contemporary Indian art within the context of a Festival of India being staged by the government of India in collaboration with Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi in collaboration with Margaret Thatcher in London for purposes, very wide set of purposes and intents and consequences, but very certainly a national projection. So I bring in this question to also problematize both the presentation of the Festival of India exhibitions, but also to problematize the critique of the nation or the national through an exhibitory process. So I think that there has to be a double view on this. On a larger scale of reference, the suspicion in Europe of nation and nationhood and nationalism has a history going back to the 19th century and culminates, of course, in the terrible wars of the 20th century. This fixes the critique of the nation state for subsequent discourse all around the world. The concept of experience of the concept and experience of the socialist countries is something else. The revolution undertook massive realignments of region, people, nation, cultures. From the utopian idea of the collective, it was set in place, the utopian idea of the collective was set in place by an overdetermined statehood and suffered tragic dissolution, as we know. Now, the meaning of the word nation, nationality, nationhood are different for the colonized countries during the process of decolonization, in the early phase of post-coloniality, when a republic and a citizenry are in the making, and then during globalization, when nations endorse new liberal capital for their fair or foe developmental agendas. We are suspicious, of course, of consensus. And I'm speaking now in a moment where Britain is arguing this return to the sense of the nation. So in many ways, this will go, will be in some sort of tandem dialogue with it. The meaning of the word consensus is suspicious, and we actively seek dissensus. This too, however, in my view, can be placed either within the nation or without. And this term that I'm using, within the nation or without, comes from Partha Chatterjee, a great political theorist in India, subaltern, Marxist subaltern theorist. While there is deserved contempt for the nation paradigm, there are, in my view, some advantages in fighting for change from within the willed nation and the constituted state. The proximity brings keenly calibrated understanding of society and polity. Distortions in the economy are punctually apparent at micro levels, and several forms of inequality rooted in the civilizational imagination and instrumentalized by the nation state are available for focused scrutiny. For example, the Dalit question, and the way the polity now has turned, the nature of the polity is led by a Dalit consciousness, which is in some senses contests the civilizational and nation state idea that has been developed since independence. India at the moment has a despicable government, defining the nation in near fascist terms and controlling an overdriven state. Even so, I would say the evil twin of neoliberal capitalism is primarily the erased sense of globality. It delivers countries worldwide into the ever tighter grip of capital. It's interesting, it's quite amazing that I had the opportunity to meet T.J. Clark yesterday. And T.J. Clark, and this is public because it's going to appear in the London Review of Books, was arguing for Brexit. And he was arguing from a very strong left position. And I think that we should put all these positions on board in a sense, despite the utter despair and disgust of the majority of internationalists in Britain. The question from a Marxist position would be interesting, particularly, and I was interested by it because the Indian Marxists have actually held on to the idea of the nation state in order to fight precisely neoliberal capital, not successfully, but certainly as one possible route to take. The nation is not an evil twin, but a slave of neoliberal capital. One can despise it the more for that reason, or utilize its claimed coherence, pitch new ideas into the public sphere, defeat the right wing on a democratic front, and stir up domestic urgency for reform, radical action, and resistance. Thus I argue now, as before, from within or without the nation still remains, to my mind, an open question, with dissensus as the key word for within the nation state. Where does the Festival of India project and related exhibitionary typologies stand in relation to the above? This frame is, of course, too grand for the frame of the nation state, and its ideology and its critique is too grand for something as simple as cultural diplomacy, which the Festival of India was. But there is another frame which these festival exhibitions, not by the initial government ideology, but through the curatorial practice, did attempt, which was the civilizational nature of India's national self-image. And I would like to here deliberately bring in the figure of K.G. Subramaniam, who's been referred to by Vivan and then by David, because this understanding of the indigenous and the contemporary within a larger civilizational context is something that is part of Indian nationalism throughout the 20th century. And it is present in Tagore, it is part of the Antiniketan ideology, and Subramaniam was a very important figure in actually making it engage with the modern in ways that almost no other Indian artist has, to find ways to engage with the modern via this paradigm. And it brought into question, obviously, as I said, the indigenous and the contemporary, the high and low, the art and craft categories, and these festival Indias at their best, and they were not always very clear in what they were presenting, but at their best might have addressed this question. The moment when these took place, of course, the critique of the festival framework should come from an examination of the timing and the purpose of Indira Gandhi's need to showcase India's civilizational status through these categories. And a cynical reading and a correct critical reading will tell us that Indira Gandhi, in her post-emergency status, foresaw India's turn towards neoliberal capital and made a pragmatic offering of culture as redeemable exchange value for diplomacy and economics. And she, of course, was collaborating at this point or the collaborator in this case was Margaret Thatcher, and they made several combined presentations. The contemporary Indian art exhibitions in this period, in 1982, the Festival of India in London, was MoMA, which David spoke about, MoMA Oxford, and Royal Academy London. I don't want you to be mistaken, the Royal Academy did not invite or commission the exhibition. The Indian government asked, and they were generous to give the galleries at rent. So there is a big difference between an avant-garde curator placing the Indian art world in Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, and the Indian government hiring galleries in the Royal Academy to exhibit these works. So this is fundamental difference. And for that reason, there would be an automatic suspicion of the kind of representation that a government-sponsored exhibition might make, except that I would like to claim right away that there was a degree of autonomy granted to the commissioners. We were 3 commissioners. Richard Bartholomew, a very major critic from India, Akbar Padamsee, a major artist, and myself. But being youngest, I probably did that kind of legwork more, and Richard was in charge of the institutional support because it came from the National Academy was the agency. The RA show divided in 2 parts, and you're seeing 2 parts running here, indicated the range, and if I might say so, the sophistication of the art language at work, mostly paintings, some sculpture, over 2 generations. If anything, and I would like to suggest this as part of the discourse that, or the polemic that we might have around these questions, if anything, it was a modernist schema with the riff that post-colonial, postmodernism had brought. So the first part was broadly the generation after independence, the progressives, and most of you are familiar with Indian art history, for me not to annotate that. And the second exhibition was based around the ideas that had been generated on the question of the figurative and narrative through one exhibition in particular, but several in succession, Place for People. And Hamad had asked me to suggest that there were continuities of what was happening in India in terms of its own art historical understanding of the past, of the second half of the century, and this exhibition, and I think it reflected that. Further, the 1982 exhibition did, I would claim, and this is my claim for it, it is not the merit necessarily, although I believe it had some merit, and I think it showed most of the very important artists with very, very carefully selected work. It was not choosing an artist, it was choosing a work. The 1982 exhibition did, I would claim, open a discursive space and a curatorial hand, not only because it had reasonable merit, but provided a window. It was because the debate in India about modernity had contemporaneity was informed by and could contribute to the new discourse about the post-colonial in England, a critical consciousness that could usefully derail the more pastiche versions of postmodernism. The major theorists of the post-colonial have been Indian, South Asian intellectuals and writers. Britain had then developed forms of cultural critique based on Marxist premises and spelt out, as we know, through Stuart Hall and so on. Now, I would like to say that at this point we were engaging precisely in figures that were functioning within London to dislodge the continuing colonial and mindset and the ideology. So we were engaged in dialogue with Rashida Rain, who was to, 2 years later, do The Other Story. We were in dialogue with Sarath Maharaj through various meetings and interviews. Guy Brett, very importantly, who, despite the fact that this exhibition would not interest him in terms of what his own preferences are, was very supportive, precisely because of the third world idea, which was by then not the prime locus of discourse, but certainly was an inherited idea which had led to post-colonial discourse and so on. Jean Fisher, and many of our filmmakers by that time already knew Black Audio and Sankofa and the Black cinema movement, knew Laura Mulvey, and Paul Willeman and Peter Wallen. All this provided an invisible context, or at least curiosity, for Indian contemporary art in the 1980s. We had a very wide, I was quite amazed. I had written a report at the end of it. We had done probably 20 lectures over a period of three months across in the art schools sorry, Hamad is showing me the pencil. But I'd just like to mention one because it will give you an idea of the kind of dialogue we were able to establish. In the Riverside Studios, we had a very informal discussion invited by Gotthard, who had liked the exhibition very much, Salman Rushdie, a young Rushdie who had not yet published his major work, Homi Bhabha, who in my report to the government of India I said, a brilliant young scholar, also participated in the exhibition, Rashida Rain, Hanif Qureshi, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Vivan Sundaram, Sudhir Patwardhan, and myself. So you would get an idea of the kind of dialogue we were able to set up at that time. Quickly now to the Tate, the Century City exhibition, and Ivona has given you the background. But I would like to theorize a little from my point of view on this. By the end of the 20th century, there was a critical withdrawal from the nation into the post-colonial discourse and a shift of focus to the nation's from the nation space to the city space, echoing an earlier century, in the earlier century, the country-city narrative. Ivona Blaswick registered this shift and decided to try it out in the space of an exhibition at the Tate Modern as an inaugural exhibition. It was a major internationalist gesture, and in England, just apart from David Eliot, there was no such gesture of that grand nature. David Eliot had already set the frame for it in MoMA Oxford, and even though I know the history of those exhibitions, I'm absolutely amazed to see them recounted from, in year by year, the range of that vision. And it's no wonder that at that time Britain couldn't take David Eliot. And he moved on in one place and another internationally. But it would have been impossible, for example, for David Eliot to have been invited to the Tate to become the director.
I can assure you it was.
I know it was, yeah. The 9 cities have been mentioned by Ivona, and I, along with a colleague, I had a co-curator, very dear friend and a very, very close colleague, Ashish Rajadaksh, the film historian. And when we chose Bombay, it was imperative that we have a film historian or film critic working on this project. Ivona had suggested, I think had understood, that these cities would be presented at par with one another in terms of representation and space. This was not in order to establish any patently false equivalence in the significance of the work produced in these cities, but rather to treat each city as both a place and a trope. So once you were able to transform the place into a trope, you could also ask equivalent questions, even though the art production need not have been seen in equivalent terms. The exhibition unraveled, as Ivona said herself, Alfred Bau's MoMA manifesto diagram through unpredicted forms of practice erupting across the world. It mapped 20th century modernism beyond the limits of Europe and America, that's obvious. And in a sense, the Tate Modern has come round to it now and wants to open itself to other collections, to other research and other collections, through TRC and so on. But it has taken it that long. The Century City exhibition, excuse me, Ivona, was slammed by the English critics. And this slamming was done very precisely, I think, because of it being the inaugural exhibition of the Tate Modern, this great temple of modern art that had been now instituted and was being opened up to several cities. The exhibition was meant to explore through curatorial and thereby art historical discourse such historical energies that produced the modern, the combustion that energized art practices on an international plane, to locate where and in which decade did other cultures lay claim to modernity as a historically co-produced project. It was, I believe, intended to stage a visual exposition that worked with a diachronic and synchronic schema, a chronological and situational logic. The 9 cities mapping the 20th century were geographical spaces, urban places, as well as temporal conjunctures in the 20th century. It was left to the invited curators to choose the city and the decade. And Ashish and I chose Bombay. First, Bombay for very many reasons. We had thought of the 1940s, which would have given us the range of the Quit India movement, the Bengal famine, and the build-up to Indian independence. But probably the kind of manifestation we could make with Bombay would have been very different and probably somewhat limiting. Bombay, of course, as you know, is India's first and most industrialized city, including an advanced working class movement. Since the 20th century, the capital of Indian modernity, now at the turn of the century, the negotiating ground of comprador bourgeoisie, neoliberal elite, mafia networks, and of course Bollywood. In some senses, we did actually try to make some kind of a sign manifestation, a kind of sign system to indicate this. A city, it was also a city which in 1990, from the early 90s, but 1992 turned its back on a cosmopolitan history and multi-religious community in favor of right-wing ideology and real estate over trade union politics. In this sense, Ashish and I believe that we were taking the idea of a conjuncture, a political conjuncture, built into the century city idea itself, into a punctually contemporary moment, into a city that is both aspirational and now despairingly addressing the future through right-wing politics.